For decades, Russia built its image as an unbeatable superpower, disciplined, predictable, and feared. But on the battlefields of Ukraine, that reputation collapsed. Every so-called perfect Russian plan was anticipated, intercepted, and turned against the Kremlin itself. From Hostomel in 2022 to the offensives of 2025, Ukraine turned Russian mistakes into weapons. Today, you're going to understand how Putin's most closely guarded military secret became the biggest disaster of the war. On the first day of the invasion, Russia had a plan that looked perfect on paper. The idea was to capture Kyiv in less than 72 hours, decapitate the Ukrainian government, and present the world with a lightning-fast victory. The key point of that operation was Hostomel Airport, located just 25 kilometers from the capital. The logic was typical of Soviet doctrine: strike at the enemy's political heart before they have time to react. To achieve this, Moscow deployed one of its most trusted forces, the VDV airborne troops, known for their rapid and coordinated operations. Mi-8 and Mi-24 helicopters took off in successive waves, carrying hundreds of paratroopers whose mission was to seize the airport intact, securing a direct air bridge for the armored columns advancing by land. The plan depended on two factors: speed and surprise. But there was one problem. Russia forgot it was fighting someone who knew its tactics better than any army in the world. For decades, Ukraine had studied, trained, and fought under the same Soviet playbook. Every pattern, every maneuver, every predictable sequence was part of Ukraine's own military history. So, when the radars detected Russian helicopters advancing toward Hostomel, the defenses were already prepared. The ambush began before the landing even started. Manpads, portable anti-air systems like the Stinger and the Igla, were positioned in staggered lines, turning the sky into a deadly trap. Several helicopters were shot down in the first hours, including a Mi-8 carrying elite troops. On the ground, Ukrainian forces had already blocked the main runway with vehicles and craters, preventing any attempt by heavy transport aircraft to land. What was supposed to be a swift occupation turned into a chaotic 36-hour battle. The Russian paratroopers were cut off, with no reinforcements and under constant fire from Ukrainian artillery and drones. By the time the ground columns finally approached, the airport was already a graveyard of wrecked armor and scattered bodies. Hostomel was the moment the myth of the Russian blitzkrieg died. The failure there prevented the capture of Kyiv and forced the Kremlin to face a kind of war it had never planned for. A war of resistance, intelligence, and attrition. The second major blow to Russia's so-called perfect plan didn't come from a weapon. It came from an illusion. In the summer of 2022, while the world focused on the southern front, Ukraine prepared one of the most ingenious maneuvers in modern warfare. A strategic deception worthy of NATO's finest playbooks. It all began with an announcement. The Ukrainian command openly declared that a major offensive was about to begin in Kherson, in the south of the country. Official statements, public briefings, and even international reports reinforced the narrative. The goal was simple: make Russia believe that Kherson would be the new epicenter of the war. And the trick worked. Fearing the loss of the city, the Kremlin redeployed its best units to strengthen defenses in the south. Satellites captured entire columns crossing the Dnipro River, leaving the north almost unguarded. Meanwhile, the real offensive was being prepared hundreds of kilometers away, in Kharkiv. For weeks, Ukrainian units quietly stockpiled ammunition, armored vehicles, and fuel, using secondary routes and night operations to avoid aerial reconnaissance. Communications were encrypted and masked by fake transmissions, simulating routine training exercises. When the attack began on September 6th, the impact was devastating. Russian forces in the region were unprepared, with stretched supply lines and collapsing morale. In just 5 days, Ukrainian troops advanced more than 70 kilometers, liberating dozens of villages and capturing entire ammunition depots intact. Strategic cities like Izium and Kupiansk, vital as logistical hubs and supply routes for Russia's entire eastern front, fell one after another. The loss of these points dismantled the supply chain and forced Russian troops into a hasty retreat. What followed was the complete collapse of the front line. Russian soldiers abandoned positions, vehicles, and even fully operational tanks in order to escape encirclement. Satellite images showed entire columns of armor left behind on the roads, many still loaded with fuel and ammunition. In less than a week, Ukraine recaptured more territory than Russia had gained in months. The operation was a masterclass in psychological warfare. a strike where disinformation became a weapon and intelligence turned the battlefield into a chessboard. After deceiving the enemy in Kharkiv, Ukraine realized something even greater, that it wasn't enough to predict Russia's moves. It was time to completely change the way it fought and turn technology into real power on the battlefield. What began as improvisation became a silent revolution. When the first commercial drones appeared at the front, few imagined they would redefine the entire dynamic of the war. Ukraine turned low-cost civilian equipment into high-precision weapons, launching an era where creativity defeated industrial might. At first, the drones were simple quadcopters bought from retail websites used only for reconnaissance, but soon, engineers and soldiers began modifying everything: sensors, batteries, cameras, and even navigation software. The result was an improvised yet deadly fleet. Today, every Ukrainian unit has its own drone division, with operators trained in reconnaissance, strike missions, and electronic warfare. This adaptation gave rise to a new type of soldier, the FPV pilot, an operator who from inside a shelter guides a drone as if it were a guided missile through virtual reality goggles. These small machines can carry grenades, shaped charges, or light thermobaric explosives. The precision is terrifying. A $400 drone can destroy a multi-million-dollar tank. The numbers speak for themselves. According to military estimates, up to 60% of recent Russian losses involve the direct use of Ukrainian drones, whether through reconnaissance guiding artillery strikes or direct attacks on armored vehicles and fortified positions. And the most impressive part is the speed of evolution. Every week on the battlefield brings new models, new configurations, and new tactics. But the revolution didn't stay in the air. At sea, Ukraine took a step no country had ever attempted before: naval drones. In 2023, small unmanned boats equipped with thermal cameras and explosive payloads attacked ships of the Black Sea Fleet anchored in Crimea. The impact was so significant that Russia pulled much of its fleet from Sevastopol to more distant ports, losing control over entire sections of the sea. All of this was possible because Ukraine built a decentralized network of innovation. Small startups, improvised labs, and even universities work hand in hand with the armed forces, developing new technologies in a matter of weeks, something unthinkable for Russia's defense industry, trapped in slow and bureaucratic processes. The drone war is no longer about who has the biggest arsenal. It's about who adapts faster. And in that race, Ukraine turned improvisation into art, and art into a lethal advantage. Up to that point, Ukraine had already proven it could win through creativity. But when that creativity merged with the technology of the world's leading powers, the battlefield changed completely. Ukraine's greatest advantage wasn't just courage. It was the ability to turn foreign aid into real power. When the West decided to bet on Ukrainian resistance, it didn't just send weapons. It sent precision tools capable of shifting the balance of the war. The first true game-changer came with the HIMARS artillery systems. These American-made high-mobility, multiple rocket launchers allowed Ukraine to do something that had been impossible before: strike targets with pinpoint accuracy at distances over 80 kilometers. With HIMARS, Russian ammunition depots, command centers, and supply lines that once seemed untouchable started exploding one after another. Each launch represented a cut to the logistical backbone of the invasion. Satellite images showed perfectly centered craters in heavily fortified installations, and Russia was forced to move its supply depots over 100 kilometers from the front line, a change that slowed down its entire war machine. But air power was still a problem. For months, Russian fighters dominated the skies over the front. That began to change with the arrival of the F-16s. More than just aircraft, they represented a new era for the Ukrainian Air Force. Equipped with AESA radars and AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, the F-16s give Ukraine the ability to detect and engage Russian aircraft before even being seen. With these jets, Ukraine doesn't just defend its skies, it actively challenges Russian air supremacy, forcing Moscow to pull back its bombing operations to safer regions. And the balance didn't shift only in the air. On the ground, the Patriot systems proved that even Russia's most feared weapons could be defeated. In 2023, a Kinzhal hypersonic missile, showcased by Putin as impossible to intercept, was shot down by a Patriot battery over Kyiv. The symbolic impact was enormous. The world watched live as the myth of Russian invincibility was shattered. Ukraine's true strength, however, doesn't lie only in its weapons, but in how it uses them. While Russia operates in a centralized and sluggish manner, the Ukrainians combine every piece of Western technology with their own battlefield tactics, adapting complex systems to the realities of a fluid war. This synergy between technology and improvisation achieved the impossible, leveling the fight against a much larger enemy and beginning to win. Russia entered the war believing it would show the world its absolute power, but in the end, it was the very system it created, predictable, rigid, and isolated, that began to fall apart. 3 years after the invasion began, what was supposed to be a show of strength has turned into a strategic catastrophe for Moscow. Russian losses have already surpassed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, dead or wounded, along with more than 15,000 armored vehicles and tanks destroyed or captured. The replacement rate is unsustainable. Factories operate around the clock but depend on imported parts and materials that sanctions cut off long ago. The result is an army increasingly equipped with technology from the 1980s, a brutal contrast to the image of modernity the Kremlin tried to sell to the world. But the real collapse isn't just on the front, it's in the economy. Energy revenue, the foundation of Russian power, has dropped sharply due to the European embargo and the price cap imposed on oil. Military spending now consumes more than a third of the federal budget, and inflation has pushed the cost of living to levels reminiscent of the final days of the Soviet Union. To sustain the war, Moscow relies more and more on alliances of convenience with countries like China, Iran, and North Korea, deals that bring second-rate technology in exchange for influence and dependence. Meanwhile, the opposite of what Putin wanted has become reality. Ukraine has emerged stronger, more integrated with the West, and with a modern, battle-hardened army, and NATO, which the Kremlin sought to divide, has never been so united and expanded. In the end, the war revealed an uncomfortable truth. Brute force can conquer territory, but it doesn't guarantee power. True power comes from intelligence, adaptation, and unity. And that's why, despite all the losses, Ukraine still stands, while Russia remains trapped in the very snare it built for itself. As unbelievable as it may sound, Russia's collapse is only just beginning. When its factories could no longer produce new tanks, Moscow was forced to do the unthinkable, bring Soviet-era machines back to life. Click on the video now appearing on your screen and see how the so-called zombie tanks reveal Russia's true desperation on the battlefield. And don't forget to subscribe to The Military Ground. See you there.